Policy on how to develop a city or how the city relates to the countryside or the country. In the summer I compared things between Australia and the Netherlands just because of course that's very familiar terrain for us, and if you want to do a first exploration referring back to something that you know very well makes it much easier. At that point I was talking about transport and dependency on transport, which becomes...
Rápidamente quiero decir algo de OMA y en particular de Dave. Para nuestro taller es realmente un momento bien importante poder contar con OMA porque sin lugar a duda consideramos que es la oficina más influyente de la arquitectura contemporánea. Nos animamos a decir esto porque en el último cuarto de siglo, en realidad es un poco más, las ideas, las publicaciones, los proyectos y las obras que ha hecho OMA con el liderazgo de Rem Koolhaas han estado en boca y en los tableros de todos los estudios del mundo, porque la verdad que la producción de OMA quedó registrada y construida en buena parte del planeta, y sin lugar a dudas toda su producción marca una época y marca una manera de entender una nueva visión de la disciplina que OMA llevó a extremos, y por eso nos resulta tan seductora y tan provocadora y tan interesante contar con ellos. Podría hablar mucho más, pero me parece que lo interesante es escucharlo a David. Está bueno que sepan que David Gianotten es hoy socio, se llama Managing Partner, su rol en OMA. Está a cargo de toda la producción y del desarrollo en todo el mundo de los proyectos en términos de organizar financiera y logísticamente el desarrollo y las estrategias de cómo la oficina llega a todas partes del mundo. Aparte de ese rol, David tiene su propio portfolio de proyectos dentro de OMA como proyectista, líder de esos proyectos. Para mencionar algunos, de las que están actualmente en desarrollo, está a cargo del Performing Arts Center en Taipei, del master plan de la ciudad del Feyenoord, que es un club de fútbol en the Netherlands, y de la construcción del nuevo estadio del Feyenoord, donde en algún momento, si podemos después, vamos a conocer algo más de la historia de David con el Feyenoord, que es bien interesante. Como así también la reconversión de un complejo de prisiones que va a transformarse en un lugar con viviendas y departamentos. Todos estos son proyectos que en estos momentos se están desarrollando. A su vez, tuvo a cargo una serie de importantes proyectos estos últimos años en distintos lugares de Asia, donde él estuvo como a cargo de la oficina, en Bali, con complejos residenciales, en Shenzhen, en China, con el Prince Plaza, el White Cube en África, que hay unos documentales interesantes también para que se puedan ver, el M Pavilion en Australia, donde David estuvo unos años, y las oficinas centrales de la Bolsa de Comercio de Shenzhen, ¿no? Todos estos proyectos entre el 2013 y el 2020. También es interesante saber que todos estos proyectos, bueno, han sido premiados y todo esto estuvo un poco a cargo de él dentro de la oficina, y también se lo llevó a dar conferencias en todo el mundo, y hay algo interesante que tal vez volvamos sobre eso después al final de la charla, cuando una de sus lectures, una de sus conferencias habla de la velocidad y el riesgo en la arquitectura. Me parece que es algo que va a estar bueno poder conversar con él. Hablando un poco de la historia de David, él formó parte del estudio Search en Holanda hasta el 2008, donde se suma a OMA, donde se comienza a ser parte del sector oriente, en esta mirada planetaria de la oficina, y se transforma en socio a partir del 2010. En 2015 vuelve a Rotterdam, a the Netherlands, donde hoy se encuentra. Y también es interesante que tiene su carrera docente en el Instituto de Tecnología de Eindhoven y de la Escuela de Verano de Netherlands en Asia. Así que hecha esta breve introducción, David, I've finished with this little introduction and your view. welcome. I told you I told you again because we talked a few minutes after this connection. Thank you really very much. This is yours. Welcome to Nación.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm sorry I don't speak Spanish, else I would have tried, but I can't. I will try to speak as clear as possible in English so that you can follow. I will share my screen first. I hope that you now start seeing something. So what I will try to do tonight is to talk about a research project that we have commenced in 2012 and that has led to an exhibition in the Guggenheim Museum in New York last year. Unfortunately, due to Corona, of course, it was not so easy to go to the exhibition, but it will travel around the world, so hopefully there will be other opportunities in other museums. First, I will talk a little bit about OMA and about myself, to not introduce myself again, but to show you how we are organized, but also how we deal with research and with our own fascination. So OMA is an architecture office that many of you know because of its buildings. But next to an architecture office, we are also a think tank, which is the mirror image of our office, and it's called AMO. With AMO, we do a lot of writing. We do a lot of exhibitions, we do a lot of furniture design and fashion, but above all, with AMO, we do a lot of research worldwide. We have a research agenda within the office that we revisit every 6 months, and where we table subjects amongst the partners that we think are relevant in the world of architecture, fashion, or design. And where we approach the research from an intellectual point of view and not necessarily from a design point of view. As a philosophy, OMA puts 25% of its profit into this research proactively, so that we can do the research independent and that we can make collaborations with universities or with companies after we have done our first own take on the subject. Something we have done also with Countryside over the last 10 years. OMA is organized in 3 different zones. The Americas, run from the New York office. Then Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, run from the Rotterdam office in the Netherlands, which is also our original headquarters. And then Asia and Australia, which is run from the Hong Kong office and the Brisbane office. And we have an office in Australia since about 3 years. We have 8 partners, some that came from outside of OMA, like myself, some that grew up within OMA from intern to partner. Rem Koolhaas, our founding partner, and myself work around the globe and also are responsible for the overall running of the office. The other partners work in these 3 zones, these 3 regional zones, and work specifically on portfolios within these zones. I will not run over my CV again, but next to running OMA's managing partner role, I'm also a professor at the TU Eindhoven, where I specialize in transformational architecture, not only related to transforming existing buildings to new buildings, but especially also the transition that we're currently globally going through related to climate, but also related to the approach of building. I've done, when I entered OMA, the first job I got on my hands was finishing the CCTV headquarters in Beijing. Very challenging building, almost 1 million square meters in GFA, of which I have done all the interiors. The first project that I won within OMA was the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, and this is then also the first project that I've done from beginning to end. And it's a building that is fully clad in sustainable glass and fully creates its own energy consumption and is totally off the grid. Recently, I've delivered the Western Australian Museum, the largest museum on the Southern Hemisphere, and the hemisphere you're also on, which had to incorporate old parliament buildings into a new museum. And one of my main subjects currently that I'm working on within my portfolio is working in a contextual environment, mostly difficult environments of underdeveloped areas, where we have to work with local craftsmanship, local materials, and create an impact, especially on the sustainable side of our profession. And then the project that is anticipated by many and was already, I think, mentioned by Pablo is the Taipei Performing Arts Center, which is after 13 years and now almost finished and will open its doors this year. A project of which I've done the competition and now also responsible for the delivery. For us, it's very important to be involved in projects from the very, very early part. And that's also why we have AMO and our research-focused agenda, so that we can initiate discussion, initiate research, and initiate projects that we then later on work on ourselves and hopefully till completion. You will never encounter something that we did start but did not finish, because we simply don't work like that. What we always try to do is to create something that was unexpected, but especially that was not asked. Because the questions that we normally get are relatively boring. Things need to go fast, things need to be cheap, and things need to be great. These things in itself are not necessarily what drives us. We prefer to go for the maximum, including these terms, but especially not focused on them, which we call the impossible utopia. I will talk about the countryside, the future, which is a research that we have been conducting over about 8 to 9 years. And we have done research all over the globe. We thought now urbanization is so important, and more than 50% of the people of the world live in cities or urban areas. We thought, what is the role of the countryside towards these urban areas, but also how does the countryside evolve? Now there are less people and there's also less craftsmanship there, while demands obviously also on the countryside rise. Interesting given is that on the city, and we are part of that ourselves, there's endless writing, there's endless research. However, on the countryside, when we started, there was not much. And we believe that that is a kind of interesting contradiction. And we found out that mainly that is because people, and this is in our profession, of course, architecture and urbanism, people think they know about the countryside and still need to learn about the city. But is it not the other way around? Is it not that we know a lot about the city now, its function, its malfunction, its challenges, its new future planning terms, and that we actually don't know much anymore about the countryside and what the future of the countryside is. And we want you to contribute to bring this back a little bit more into balance. We did the research all over the globe, as I said, but we can, of course, not cover in depth all areas. So we choose 13 topics, and you see them here indicated in red, in different areas of the world where we research different subjects. And I will tonight present 5 of these subjects. Subjects I've been involved in the research, so I can try to highlight the different elements. As I said, we presented the research in the famous Frank Lloyd Wright Guggenheim Museum in New York, and it was really interesting because the first time that an architect was able to take over the full rotunda and create a full story. Obviously, this building is great for telling stories because it's almost like a continuous loop. We opened on the 22nd of February last year, and unfortunately the exhibition was closed for public only 3 weeks after because of COVID-19. It reopened a little bit in September until the end of October, and then it was closed again. And in February this year, it was dismantled. As I said, it's gonna travel, so hopefully the exposure of the exhibition will be larger than we were able to do in New York. One of the main reasons why this research started is that because Rem Koolhaas and myself like to go to Switzerland a lot. We both have a second home there in a rural area, and we noticed actually that these rural areas were declining rapidly. But at the same time, these areas were also encountering new people. So people that were originally from there, they left and moved to the city and even left their property sometimes in not too good state. Yet, like we did ourselves, people from outside of the villages bought these houses and started to refurbish them and started to use them almost like an escape from the city. And they started to live like rural people, or in the classical sense, rural people. And if you would look at this guy, you would also say he is from there. But he turned out to be a nuclear scientist from Frankfurt that was on his holiday. So these type of interesting changes happen constantly. And we thought, how does this actually work? Because the traditional point of view of the countryside is obviously a self-sustaining society, part of the society that provides for food, that provides for energy, or that provides kind of people in their direct first needs. However, this is not really true anymore, because this is what kind of the modern countryside very often looks like. A highly efficient, highly engineered realm where production, in this case food, but we will see other examples as well in this lecture, kind of take over, and there is nothing anymore of this classical point of view of providing a self-providing society directly in the countryside. Here another example of how, for example, currently countries where animals cannot easily be outside because of the climate provide in the needs of, for example, dairy or meat anyway, and not the cows, for in this case, never see the real outside world, but they're fully in the countryside, but then in a huge production facility. As I said, only 2 years ago, the coin flipped. More people are living in urban areas than rural areas. And this, of course, has a huge impact because very often the rural still provides services to the urban. And the balance is slightly off. In the 1950s, you see here that big parts of the globe were still mainly rural. In this case, the green countries. This is per country, not necessarily per area. And the urban areas were clearly indicated. And for example, your country was already urbanized to a high level then. However, if you look now and you look forward to 2050, you see that there are only a few countries left that have a majority of rural areas, and most countries have a majority of urban areas. This, of course, strengthens the question, how is this balance and what is the country still aside providing? At the same time, and there is another situation going on, and that is that about half of the earth is protected these days. It's conservation area, or it is designated to be a conservation area. And this, of course, also means that these rural areas very often, which is much more than the urban areas, cannot fully provide anymore because they are protected landscapes. Interestingly enough, when we started the research, we found out that actually many leaders, good or bad, specific or unspecific, democratic or non-democratic, have always been very interested in the rural areas or the countryside. They have been writing plans about the role of the countryside because they understood very well that the urban areas maybe are the main focus points, but without the countryside and without exploiting this countryside, the rural areas would not be able to exist. And this is already going on over decades. So it's not something that is only a modern idea, because of course climate change also asks us to look at this balance in many instances as well. So while we all still have maybe an almost romantic idea about the countryside and about craftsmanship of the countryside, this is long gone in many places. The first example I would like to give to you is kind of the central spine of the US. A spine that obviously is rural, and everybody of us knows that on the East Coast and on the West Coast, the US is mainly urbanized. This core is also the core that voted Mr. Trump to power. Luckily now that is not the case anymore, but that had a huge impact. And the influence of this area was very underestimated by the urban areas. And you see that this area has been flattened over the years significantly and has actually become a huge production facility that is endless and endless from the north to the south of the US, as flat as possible and with an enormous amount of huge spaces where food is harvested. About 50% of this food stays within the US or goes to the urban areas of the US, and about 50% is exported. An area that is so vast and almost no settlements are within that you can almost not imagine. We flew a drone from the top till the bottom over this area, and this is a shot from this drone, and it is almost all the same, the whole length of the movie, and the movie is about 4.5 hours. The interesting thing about this area is that it looks empty and it looks uncontrolled and it looks very one-sided, but when you look carefully, it's an area that is extremely well connected. it is completely observed from above, and it is completely monitored from above. So it is a high technical area as well, although you can't really see this. And the people that are harvesting in these vast areas are actually getting these type of images from out of the earth, and they see which crops are ready to be harvested, and then they can program this into their machines simply by existing systems from their farm. And then these huge machines, which are highly controlled computers, and this is a cockpit of one of these things, start simply harvesting in an enormous length, as you have just seen. And therefore, the farmer now is also a highly technical skilled profession. This means that what we did in the past, we had crops, for example, potatoes next to corn, next to vegetables, next to other things, has become a situation where we try to create as much length as possible and one crop as long as possible, so that these machines can go on and on and on and harvest when they get the signal the crop is ready. We also, in this same aspect, looked at our own country. As you know, the Netherlands is a very small country in Europe, but we produce 70% of all vegetables that are eaten in Europe. And we don't do that outside anymore. We do that in our glass boxes that are probably also known to you. And this has become science. It goes extremely fast. For example, a tomato is going from a seed to harvesting and going to a market or a supermarket within 12 days from a facility like this. So that is pure science based on light, based on how to grow which crop as fast as possible, very often even without any soil. In this realm, both in America and in our own country, scientists are analyzing the fact that we are only producing in the countryside single crops in very large amounts next to each other. And they see that biodiversity and also the vitamins within these crops are actually going down because there's no cross-fertilization anymore, and because it's, of course, so highly technical. And what you see is that universities now look at this technicality in a different way. And they're actually going back to the past, but even further, they're going to mix these type of crops and make them even smaller, sometimes even centimeters big, into each other. That is, of course, first tested in a lab environment, what it brings. But the main reason to do something like this is because of the cross-fertilization. And that means that you get kind of fields in the countryside where every square centimeters is recorded, and we know what is growing where, and also how the relationships between plants actually work, so that they can help grow the different crops in an efficient and a much more healthy way than we do today. And what actually happens is, because we put them so close together again, the biotope under the ground is fed through the different nutritions of the different plants, and actually all of them benefit from each other and grow healthier and very often also faster. So that means that you can not only harvest one thing from there, but that you actually can harvest many things from a single field next to each other. And that is now done and planted already, for example, here in the Netherlands, but also kind of in the US and in the south of Europe. And what you see is that not these big machines that are controlled from above the earth harvest anymore, but it is small, almost robot-like machines that harvest on the square centimeter. And that is also completely pre-programmed and completely controlled through satellites. The second place I want to show you is the north of Russia, a rural area that was very important in the development of the USSR, now for a big part Russia, and that was actually the how you could say the breeding space, but also the breed space of the country. It provided for 90% of the food that was eaten within Russia. The permafrost, which is the cold on top of a very fertile soil, created a landscape that was extremely good for providing in food. And nomads lived on these lands for a very, very long time and moved simply from field to field and then came back when the fields were healed or grown again. The interesting thing is that the connection to this countryside was very fast. A lot of people really understood the value of this hinterland. Currently, the domestic flights, and in 1987 it's still the USSR flights, but now within the Russian realm, you can almost not get to this area anymore because the role of this area has completely changed. And why did it change? It changed because of the global warming. You see that exactly here on the northern part of the image and of the globe, the global warming is most, and especially there where the permafrost and the very fertile areas of this region were. And that has led to extreme catastrophes. For example, like extreme big sinkholes where the land simply disappeared. The ice has gone in winter and in summer, and therefore the feeding grounds of these areas is completely destroyed. And these are not small things. We have seen recently, I think the last few days, a sinkhole in Mexico, but that is nothing compared to what is happening here. Also there, where this climate change is happening, you see that the ice is melting so fast that the land simply disappears and all the water is drained from it. And that means that the fertile areas turn into rocky areas, areas where nothing is to gain or nothing is to supply anymore to our urban realm. There are also advantages of it because suddenly areas that were covered under ice for centuries start disappearing, coming up again. And for example, mammoth hunters are now the rulers of this hinterland where mammoth after mammoth is found out of a total different era. People that have been harvesting and been farmers for ages has turned into this profession of finding things in the soil rather than trying to grow things on the soil. This also means that now Russia is completely reliant on its surrounding countries, the relationship with China, but also the relationship with Europe, and is providing gas and oil back in exchange for food, a total different relationship, not only within the country, but also surrounding the country. A total transformation of the countryside. The next subject is Africa, a country or a continent where rural areas have always been dominating, but in recent years, new cities start arising, or existing cities like Dar es Salaam and Dakar are growing extremely fast. They were going towards the same direction as other continents did when they developed. However, there's an interesting thing going on in Africa, where mega cities were planned and also were already under construction partly. It doesn't go that fast, and actually there's a tendency to not do this. So where it was thought that there would be also mass urbanization in a huge scale till, let's say, half of this century, we see that there is still large urbanization and there is still large cities, but we also see actually a growth within the countryside. Villages start becoming more important again in this transitioning world. Also, when you talk to Africans and you ask them questions where they would live, want to live, and how they would want to provide for their lives, they indicate very clearly that they would want to be self-sustainable and would want to be in the countryside, preferable. That had not only to do with tradition or with the tribes that they grew up in and live in, but that also simply has to do with the fact that they think it is a much more sustainable way of living. They also kind of came up with all kinds, and sorry for the pixelated picture, they also came up with all kinds of systems, informal systems, to be able to run the countryside, because of course governments want urbanization and only provide for the cities. They come up with their own banking systems, for example, that run through a mobile phone network that has been put in by China. It also has come up with its own corporations where they don't sell goods, but they actually trade goods for goods. Large areas, mainly in rural areas, where this is happening. And people that live in the rural areas simply come there and exchange. Also interesting is that these areas, the rural areas, are actually innovative areas. They are provided, for example, with solar power or sometimes even wind power, and they are extremely well connected. This is an image of a Chinese train line that is running now from the whole north of Africa to the south and from east to west, connecting mainly rural areas and actually connecting it back to the system, the economic systems of China, so that there can also be exchange between China and Africa. And you see, therefore, extremely modern trains simply coming to rural areas in Africa, huge train stations in the middle of nowhere, and then villages that are on these train lines that are extremely small and already long existing. They benefit from these connections and economically profit from them. And that means that instead of urbanization, these villages become the place where innovation is happening, but also the people that have lived in cities actually return and try to bring a second economy to these villages again. And this is about 100 meters from this train station that you just saw. And you can see, therefore, how connection of the rural areas actually brings not only kind of a choice to people, but also brings possibilities for innovation. And this is not only happening in Africa, but it's happening in many also other countries. These are images from Asia, where actually people that have been educated in the cities or in the urban areas and now went back to the countryside, started their businesses and do that completely online and provide kind of this sustainable source, or try to project this sustainable source kind of through live streams. And they simply sell their goods without anybody in between. And you can therefore, for example, buy your coconut at the farm. There's also an interesting other gap, because the world population is growing so fast, and because we need to be extremely efficient to be able to provide, for example, food, but also data and energy to the people in these urban areas. We need much, much more than we ever needed before. Even if you look in the current 20 years, we grow about 8 times what we had in 2015, what we need to produce to be able to provide for the world population. This obviously also has not only to do with growth, but also with prosperity increase, because we have more to spend. We also buy more. We're also more conscious, and therefore we want more health products or sustainable energy. However, because people went to the cities, the craftsmanship to actually produce these enormous amounts went down significantly. And an interesting situation happens there. So the countryside becomes more important for the relationship with the urban areas, and it needs to increase its productivity. However, it's also extremely aging. Young people have left a long time ago, except for in Africa, as we have just seen. And how is that solved? Interestingly enough, we saw already these machines that are controlled from satellites, but there's another trend, which is robotics. Robotics actually in the countryside or in rural areas. So on the one side, we see communication robots that we have all in home, but actually where robotics is currently used a lot are in rural areas, and are mainly assist suit company robots that simply keep people in support and help them produce to a much older age, so use their craftsmanship for much longer, and also make them much more efficient. And here you see a community in Japan which is completely producing food. It's run by people of 50 plus. It is very much full of new technology and new support, but it's actually running traditional crafts and biological produce. It provides for an area of 1/3 of Osaka, a big city in Japan. So a very interesting way of approaching kind of the craftsmanship needed to provide, and a big change. And the people obviously living directly on the area, and also kind of keeping their traditional ways of producing, for example, for rice. And then everything is transported from there towards the city. Another topic that is related to the countryside is the fact that urban areas are so extremely well connected, and we use so much energy, but especially also produce so much data that is all stored that more or less, if you would, for example, in Manhattan, would store all the data on the place itself, you would need a data center as big as Central Park. And then it needs to be 3 levels high. This would, of course, be an enormous heat source in the city, but it is not a very sustainable situation. And what you therefore see is that in large cities, sometimes areas as big as the cities themselves, this is, for example, next to Reno, industrial parks, as they call, start taking over the countryside. And what is happening here is that there are places of enormous dimension that don't produce much, but actually store mainly data in the countryside, so that the urban areas can actually ask back this data over time. And you see that it is kind of extremely large spaces for support to gigafactories for the Apple iCloud that we probably many of us use, but also all kinds of other data switch areas. And an interesting thing is that it is huge boxes that are completely closed and where there's almost no person. So you see an extremely dense urban area with many people that produce a lot of data and a lot of need a lot of energy. And then you see an area as big as these urban areas in the countryside that it kind of has these huge boxes in them that produce and store the data the urban areas need. And from the inside, these boxes look like this. Of course, data is very, very sensitive, so it's highly, highly secured. But as you can see, there are almost no people. And these things look inside like this, a kind of enormous server areas with very efficient lights to reduce the heat load, a lot of ventilation, but no people. Sometimes these areas are run by 10 to 12 people, and the only thing they do is keep security. They make sure that nobody comes into these places, and actually nobody is harming the conditions of the city in the countryside. A total new phenomenon in the countryside, and a total new providing for the city. These were the topics that I wanted to highlight. There are several other topics within the countryside. And there's also a very interesting story to tell about the history of the countryside. What is really interesting is that what we do today, and especially now in the COVID times, many of us try to leave urban areas or try to be outside in a more healthy environment, is actually a trend that is there already since the Romans, where people that lived within the cities try to go outside for their health, but also try to go outside for reflection. And reflections these days is innovation and providing for that innovation. Part of the exhibition in the Guggenheim was a sea container that we brought from the Netherlands with this highly efficient tomato production farm that we have here in the Netherlands for acres and acres. So this was literally one of these production farms in one sea container. And it provided tomatoes for the 9 big supermarkets on Manhattan for a whole year, which was a very interesting kind of letting the people in the city not only see how food is produced nowadays on the countryside, but also how highly innovative and efficient that actually is. We have created a report with AMO that is also now available in a pocket where all the subjects are told and are explained further. More data is obviously provided, as you are probably acquainted from us to see. We didn't stop the research yet. Out of our proactive research, a lot of questions came. For example, Europe asked us to work with them on the Green Deal of how to make Europe more sustainable again, and to see what the right balance between urban areas and rural areas are. Also within the UN, we have been asked to look at the effects of the climate change, not only for cities, but also for rural areas, and try to come up with this innovative micro solutions rather than trying to make everything generic. And also interesting, a lot of companies have asked us help based on the research to look into their new strategy plans of how to deal with the countryside and the balance between the countryside and the city. Thank you very much. This is what I have prepared for tonight.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. It's an amazing job, and it's very interesting for us that we are starting to study our countryside as an object to research of this year in the chair. There is a lot of things that we can think about the lecture, but first of all, I want to say something that I noted in the beginning of the lecture, which is not about the countryside, but it's about the OMA and the kind of office and the way that you work. And I think that it's interesting to our students to understand this idea of the architect that start the discussion and start the research to change the place of the discipline in which we usually be at the end of the process, just to produce the building or the formalize the politics, and you decide to change that and fix it in the beginning of the process, or probably just starting the discussions. And this is really necessary and important, and we usually talk about it with our students because it means a change in the way that we are sharing with them the learning of the profession, and it's not always they are accustomed to start to design the buildings, design the projects, and we consider that it's more important probably the process before the building than the building itself. And I really admire the way in that your office could produce that phenomena in the process. So you are an office that install the discussion, install the programs, the sites, and this is one part. But you could transform this research in projects and in buildings. This is a kind of magic that you can concrete, because perhaps you can have the idea or you can be a great designer, but to join the whole process in one office, it's really admired. I want to, if you have something to say about it, because you are the managing partner of the office, I think that you have to give us the trick.
I'm not going to give you the trick, because the biggest part of the trick is maybe very disappointing, but it's a curiosity, interest, and hard work. Kind of what we feel is that architecture has become very often a tool of the market. We are asked to provide for the market and are asked to design. And I don't know how often I have read this when a new client came to me and said, "Oh, we are so excited. We really want to work with you. Look at my brief." And then the first sentence was, "Create the highest iconic building of blah, 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 blah." And then I obviously already lost interest. We very often are asked to kind of do things by the market that they think of are fantastic, and we think of, oh, it's a bit passé, it's a bit boring, and also, why you're actually asking me that question? Did you really do research out of which this is the outcome? If that would be the case, then I would be willing to look at it. But when you ask that question, there's never any research behind it. It's just a great idea, and there's a lot of money behind it. We are all double trained within the office, in the sense of the partners. Me as an architect, but at the same time as an economist. And I just had more curiosity than just asking or answering to questions of clients. We wanted to use our own curiosity to have a look at not only the market, but also about the political system or the political topics that are going around in the world. Because next to the market that provides more money, there is the politics that retrieve more and more and more, and don't create vision plans anymore, don't try to be visionary anymore. And then that means there's a huge gap between running something and paying for something. And that gap is about vision, it's about curiosity, it's about understanding, it's about so many opportunities that are simply not touched on by these two topics. And that's also why we decided at some point to say, okay, we're going to do this proactively. What we think of now with 8 as put our brains together, put all the professions together that you have, not only architects, but also all these different professions. We think what is interesting and we list the top 4, and then we start simply working on it. We invest in that. And because we think that we get smarter from that, but also we learn from that. We can table an agenda of which we think it's relevant, rather than just iconic buildings or iconic cities. And that turned out to be an interesting approach, because we were doing that all the time already, but we were never able to broadcast it as big as we can broadcast it now. Because now we have formalized it, something that we were interested anyway, something that we liked anyway, something that we did anyway. We have now formalized it, and people think it's a trick, but it is not a trick. It's our it's our real inherent curiosity, interest, and just damn hard work. Also, people ask me, who is AMO and who is OMA? It's all the same people. There's no difference. There is no part of the office that is called AMO and no part of the office that is called OMA. It's all the same people. You work sometimes on a building, you work sometimes on a research, you work sometimes on an agenda, you work sometimes on a brief. So this is simply the translation of our minds, you could say, into an office. And what an office is these days is also very unclear. For us, it's a system. For us, it's a system that provides for our needs and provides for the food for thought. Yeah, and that is our main driver. And that sometimes delivers a building, and sometimes delivers a book, sometimes it delivers a doorknob, but that is all equally important.
Okay. I have 2 more questions before to open the question to all the people. I have here an old book. I don't know if you
Yeah.
It's a croquis from Spain, which has work of the OMA and REM between 1987 and 1992. In these 40 years, the office and the mind of REM and all of you was expanding from the buildings to the city, to the territory, to the climate, to the politics. Perhaps it always be all together, but the information that we will reach from the magazines and all of that was changing and expanding to all other dimensions. You consider that it's important to our discipline that architecture was growing in its compromise with the epoch, with how we have to act in our culture.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important because in the end, as an architect, you are a designer. You create space to be used. But at the same time, you have a huge responsibility because you leave an extremely large mark that creates a big impact on the life of people. And if you don't do that out of responsibility or out of understanding, it becomes hard to do. And I think because the market is only interested in this money, because politics is trying to retrieve and not be visionary anymore, kind of there is an enormous playing of which an architect should be interested in. It's not only scary, but it's also a huge opportunity. And I think what architects are good is building bridges, not physical bridges, but bridges between professions. We need to do all kinds of things, even in the basic profession. We need craftsmanship, we need calculations, and we need beauty. But at the same time, we can bridge these bridges easily, but we also have skills that can bridge to psychology, to politics, to research, and to research by design, which is a term that was introduced in the last 10 years and is now in universities almost as important as the classical research, in the sense of academic research. So for us, it has been actually good that the market took over and the politics retrieved. If you want to be visionary, if you want to be interested, and if you are not interested in making a quick buck, but actually trying to do something responsible with this big impact you have. So I think it's good that architects are more interested, broadly interested. And I actually think that every architect should have the curiosity, almost as an obligation, to look beyond its own profession and to reach out to others, to invite others, because we leave marks, but let's do these marks together rather than based on a brief or based on a budget or based on a planning. Do it on other merits, then it has probably a better and a more impact. And we don't know. I'm not saying this because we know. I'm saying this because we think, and then it can lead to all kinds of things. And there are sometimes successes, sometimes failures. But if you don't try, it will always be bad. Yeah?
Okay. The last by myself. As you know, we are a chair in the public university in Buenos Aires, which is a very massive faculty with a lot of students. Mm-hmm. Our chair is called, as you know, Taller Nación, which means two things. You can relate it with our nation, the territory of the Argentina, mm-hmm. But for us, it's the nation has a lot of dimensions. For example, when you talk about food and resources, and you see a work like you do with the countryside, you understand that you belong to that other nation, which is a global problem that we have to solve altogether. No? But in fact, the administration of this problem is not the same all around the world, and it has owners. For example, when you abort that problem and you study the whole planet, you think that probably the solution is to integrate the different administration of the whole planet in a moment that the civilization is going there, or how do you manage the fact that the owners of the process, for example, the books, the ships that moves the resources and has determined owners in determined places of the world. How you manage the problem that is a global problem but is administrated in different places?
I think by not managing it, but by understanding it and trying to see how it is run and trying to create a parallel system, or trying to create a localized impact. And local doesn't mean kind of tiny in a village. A local can also be on a nation or can be on a continent, but trying to create an impact that proves to the people of the place, of the belonging, I like to call it, because that's a border is never actually kind of containing something. A kind of a border is an imaginary line. Kind of there's always something that goes over it, but trying to create an impact there, that there is an understanding what the contribution is they can provide, and that can be in many ways. That can be a physical contribution, that can be an economic contribution, that can be a contribution to a more sustainable environment, but it can also be simply a contribution of knowledge, or a contribution of engagement, not necessarily being a global impact, but actually enriching a situation. So we try to not think in the terms of global, we're trying to not think in the terms of power, but we're trying to think in the terms of contribution, of kind of impact, to simply erase some of these political terms or economic terms, and try to see what knowledge can bring to that. Again, it sometimes has an effect. You said, I think in my introduction, the project White Cube in Congo we did in Africa. It was a small thingy, and we produced it ourselves. We paid for it ourselves, and there was an unbelievably good movie made about it, and about kind of the abuse of the art world of poor people, which is a topic that is not necessarily interesting to many. But now kind of every museum is kind of criticized about their history, about their collections, and about these things, just simply because we try to show what it actually did with the people there, and not necessarily trying to solve the issue, but just table it and trying to start a discussion, try to learn. And that sometimes is what we find is much more rewarding than trying to not table things, or trying to adhere to something that is only asked. And that is, again, maybe our philosophy. Also, our office is, of course, so many different generations. The office started 3 weeks before I was born. Rem could be my grandfather, but yet we are partners, and it's a total interesting conversation over generations. Kind of our youngest partners are in their 30s, 40s. They're partners in the 50s, in the 60s, and then Rem in his 70s. Kind of when you put that together and you all have the idea of thinking, then generations also don't matter. Actually, they help, because we think differently. We are brought up differently. We had different experiences. We had similar experiences 50 years apart, which also is kind of an interesting given. So that I think that is how I answer your question. It's not a concrete answer, but it is about finding the gaps between definition, being wanting to create impact without knowing beforehand, not want to have facts, but actually create facts. These type of things is where our interest lies. And of course, at the same time, we do buildings and we answer to briefs, but we always try to tweak them with our knowledge, with our own agenda. We always try to influence, and that is what we are. Yeah, and that's also how we think we stay relevant.
Yeah, I have a lot of topics to talk with you, but I think that we can open the questions. Just the last reflection, introducing countryside or Pampa. You show us that incredible new grid to see the earth with the mix of different spaces that they can grow together, and this new technology to harvest, which is and the satellites that bring the information about this aspect that looks like depends the new technologies. In other terms, looks that some intelligence that is very antique, for example, the ancient way to como se dice, sembrar, to seed in the middle of the forest is a mixed way to not the separated species. I'm sorry that I'm not explaining it well, but do you think that some intelligence of the past are kind of solutions beside the technology that you can use for implementing now in this era?
Yeah, for sure. I think I think most of these techniques are actually born from ancient knowledge of cross-fertilization, of which crop next to which crop has positive influence, which crop next to which crop has negative influence. Which soil do you use for which source? And I think these type of knowledges are now captured and are actually innovated on a larger scale, because craftsmanship and that knowledge is only available with a few people still, while we need the production of that comes out of that for an enormous scale, and that has a huge effect. So the innovation is not necessarily the way you do things, in the sense of what the basis is of the method, but the innovation is how to scale it up, or actually scale it down in this case, and make it contextual again, and therefore much more productive, and actually also much more related to the tradition and related to the custom people know. Yeah, kind of. I've been living in 7 countries in my life: Japan, China, Indonesia, the Netherlands, South Africa, America, and Norway. And kind of all these countries have their own traditions, all their own food, their own things. But in all these countries, I could buy tomatoes from where I was born. Yeah, kind of how does that work? Yeah, kind of that is kind of a kind of interesting question. Do they all need these tomatoes from the Netherlands, or do they actually don't need them? Kind of the brain is now programmed that tomatoes come from the Netherlands, so they must be good. Yeah, and therefore people pay a lot from them. But that is actually in technology sense, and also in the sense of
how you can make the best crop. Totally not true. Yeah, and that is the interesting thing. That is the rebalancing of and I call it the rebalancing, but you can also call it a transformation. Kind of because we have to scale up, because we have new technology, we actually go back closer to our roots and closer to our own circumstances, because we actually understand now that they were more efficient and effective, and we should learn from them rather than trying to implement a thing. Kind of, my kids were born in Hong Kong. They never saw a farm until we moved to the Netherlands. And the first farm they saw was a farm where all the crop was in a glass house. All the animals were standing in line, doing their thing. Yeah, kind of, that is a total different world than 60 years ago. Yeah, and how does that actually work? We're going back more to that, but then in a total scale-up situation.
David, I will try to read some of the questions we have on the YouTube here. Like,
yeah,
how do you see the impact of the crisis of the COVID-19 in the rural areas?
That's very different in different parts of the world. Kind of in countries where rural areas are still having quite a lot of people. So let's say in the places where the countries where it's a 50-50 balance, you see that COVID has a more destructive influence on the countryside than in countries where it's a 70 urban and 30% rural. And that is because people from the urban areas actually tend to go back to the rural areas or try to flee the urban areas and bring with them customs and rules and health alongside. So it's a very complex question to answer, because it's not everywhere the same globally. But I have been locked up, which almost never happened, in the Netherlands now for a year. Didn't travel. Well, normally my travel pattern is every week, you could say. What I can see here is that actually people are using the urban area as the area of knowledge and the area of economy, and the rural area the area of reflection and the area of distance, the area of health, the area of being happy on your own rather than being alone on your own in the city. So that is in here, it has a positive effect on the rural areas in the sense of that people reflect much more towards the values of it. However, in countries where that luxury is not available, you see that the rural areas get influenced much more, and the report on it is very, very little. Luckily, now we see a little bit about India. Of course, it's a disaster, but we see a little bit of what that impact actually is. So it's very contextual to be able to answer it. Sometimes the rural area is really seen as the place to go to and to be safe and healthy. But in less privileged areas, actually, the countryside is a dangerous place to be. And I think this will not restore back to what it was before COVID. It will probably create different balances, probably will create different interests. I think people will be more interested in the countryside after COVID than they were before. If that is necessarily positive, I don't know, because that time will have to tell. But I think definitely people will be wanting to invest more. And if I say investment, I don't mean money, but invest more in understanding the value of the countryside, and therefore invest more in trying to create a better balance than it was before. So I hope in the end it will be positive, but it is not necessarily said it will be everywhere.
Great, thank you. I'll try to read a long question now. Someone asked, talking about how these spaces of digital storage, cloud servers, as well as the field of agricultural production, they both require the consumption of enormous amounts of rural space and electric energy. Do you consider that a decentralized paradigm of production, where our production is lower, but at the same time it may be better redistributed globally, could it become relevant to solve this urban conflict in a sustainable way?
Again, a difficult question, a good one though. I think the scale up of the last 40 years has been so enormous that trying to counterattack that by decentralization and by smaller pixels will be extremely hard. So I think there are areas that are not giants yet, or both in the urban and in the countryside term. They can probably benefit from redistribution. They can probably benefit from trying to make it smaller. However, there are also areas that are so far developed into these giants that I think the best answer is to actually keep things giant and therefore also keep other areas unaffected, and actually that you can provide the necessity which creates damage through a giant impact on a specific place, but next to that can actually create new impact or new balance next to it on unaffected areas from these giants. So I think they will always live in a kind of symbiosis. It should not be either or. It should, how do they live together? And where is the best solution, the giant, and where is the best solution, redistribution, or even the dwarf in some cases? I think that is a complex question because we don't know the impact yet of these giants. We don't although we have a lot of research over the last 20, 30 years, but the real effect on people, the real effect on the climate, the real effect on our food production, the real effect on craftsmanship is still to be determined. It's not known to us yet. We can hinge for it, but we don't know it. So we're trying to influence something of which we don't exactly know where it's going. So I think it's going to be a combination. And I definitely don't want to rule out the giants because they probably protect areas that we need to protect.
Thank you. Another question. How can the reactivation of rural population coexist with new means of production which tend towards automatization and need highly skilled technicians?
Sorry, can you repeat? Because I couldn't really follow the first part.
How can the reactivation of rural population coexist with new means of production which tend towards automatization and need highly skilled technicians?
They actually can coexist very well, or that's at least coming out of our research of the last few years. Is the interesting thing is that the people that always stayed on the countryside have an enormous love for that countryside and want to kind of bring forward the benefits from that. And the benefits for the city, but also the benefit for themselves and the benefit for the climate. So they have an enormous innovative mindset. They not necessarily want tradition only, and they also understand that the role they play is very, very different, even in poor areas. At the same time, people that lived in the cities and are educated in the cities and are there, and especially in the younger generation, feel lost sometimes in these cities and these giants, although they have the knowledge of this innovation, have the highly technical capabilities that you need. And they come back to the countryside. Very often it's back. Yeah, very often their generation before them or 2 generations before them came from there, and they come back. And they affect, obviously, with their knowledge, the possibility of people that actually understand that they are providing something important. And that mix of people is actually creating a total new look towards the countryside, which is highly innovative and based on traditional methods. And that is kind of an interesting possibility, and I think it will keep existing, and they actually need to coexist.
Okay, another question. I have a question regarding sea level rise and its consequences for those living in coastal areas. What impact do you think this climate-induced migration have in the countryside?
Huge. As you probably know, although we are a very small country, also 2/3 of our country is under sea level, and was actually invented land by just pumping water out and putting dikes around it. And you see that created a flat land that can be highly efficient to grow crops and stuff like that. But the rising sea level is, of course, a threat to this, not only for us, but for many places. What we see is that because of the innovation, because of the high technical possibilities, we need less land to produce much more. And that also means some of that land that becomes available, because we were very inefficient, we were not able to, we can give back to, for example, buffering of water, or creating zones which can flood if they need to, because they don't damage production or they don't damage people. So what you get is not only highly engineered solutions to that, but also solutions of almost political dimensions, where you say here it can flood and here it cannot, and that these two things together hopefully will create a situation that we can stay ahead of this when we hopefully can find a situation where the sea level doesn't rise as fast anymore as it does today. But that's ideological talk. If we can manage that, is totally in the sky. But let's assume we can have influence by being gracious and giving back things we claimed.
Good.
Inés,
Sí.
Espera un segundo. David, lucky there is a lot of questions. I don't know if you are really tired, it's too late. Please tell us, just to
No,
keep
we can
yourself.
keep on going for another 15 minutes, but then it's 1:45, and my kids probably wake me up at 7:30, so then I would like to go to bed, but let's go for another 15 minutes.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
Okay, maybe one of the teachers here want to ask a question, or do I keep reading here?
No, está bien las preguntas, está bueno. Sí. Por ahí
Okay.
hay alguna que pregunta si conoció Argentina, no lo conoce, o sea, salteemos esas. Hay un par de preguntas interesantes. Dale.
As AMO, what project or research do you think had the most impact or will have over the agenda imposed by the markets?
In the whole scheduling of AMO, our whole agenda? Ooh.
They don't specify.
That's kind of
experience.
interesting. I think countryside currently has a huge impact, but we of course already moved on. So we are already doing new research for something else for about 4 years now. So I think you can't say that. It's almost the same question as which building you built is the most beautiful one and the most successful one. You can also not say that, because all of them are relevant. Maybe not anymore, but they have been relevant at a point of time, and they have been conceived for a certain reason. So I think every AMO research contributes to our own knowledge building and thinking, and also later on to our portfolio. We never value things, so we never put money towards them, for example, which brought up the most money, or we never looked at what research was followed by most universities or triggered studios in other universities. We see that the discussion about the countryside has become bigger beyond AMO as well, which we are very happy about, because again, we can only do so much with our group of people. So I'm very happy you guys, for example, talk about it in Argentina on your own, in your own premises for your own needs. So as long as we trigger something, I call it successful. And even when that's on our own curiosity or knowledge. So I can't say it. I think AMO in itself is just a vehicle which helps us to just simply talk about the things we want to talk about and love to talk about. And if others follow, that's nice, but not necessary.
Okay, and do you think that in the future, the number of people living in rural areas will be higher than the ones living in the cities?
Difficult to predict, but I think it will definitely not grow as fast anymore. The urban growth will not be as fast anymore as it has been over the last 50 years. So there will be definitely a plateau somewhere in that growth. Probably there will be a different balance. And you see already that cities are reaching their limits. People are not willing to accept things that come with urbanization or giants anymore. Which also not necessary anymore because of new technology and innovation. So, and innovation in design is a very important part of that too. Kind of, I think in this time, designers have the most influence they ever had, if they want to, because everything starts with curiosity, starts with curation, starts with thinking these days. So the influence a designer can have is enormous. So I think there will be a different balance, not necessarily less urbanization, but less growth of urbanization for sure. And maybe like in Africa, where the predictions were totally off. In other areas it will be the same. I don't know.
Okay, and this is a personal question. Can you tell us about your actual research subject?
No. No, of course I would love to, but when it's ready, we talk about it. When it's not, and I don't mean finished. When we are ready to talk about it, i.e. that we think we know enough to be able to talk about it, we will talk about it. And it can also be that what we're doing currently never sees the daylight because we feel that actually what we discover is insignificant or irrelevant. And then we had fun for 4 years and then we figure it out later. Again, I think it's such a personal driver that you can only talk about it when you feel ready. Yeah. We are very insecure about what we do, and that sounds maybe kind of strange out of my mouth, but we are very insecure very often when we table it. When we tabled 8-9 years ago, the countryside, we were very, very insecure about it because there was very little spoken about it. Architects didn't really pay attention to it. Kind of how, so should it ever deliver anything? We don't know. Now, we delivered now something of which we think can be a start of a discussion of a different balance. What we are currently doing is very, very different than the countryside, and that is what I can say about it. It's fun, though.
Dave, it was an amazing conversation. We really appreciate a lot. We appreciate the idea that insecurity is a way to go further away. I'd like to talk with the students that when I meet you in Monterrey, Mexico in 2007, you were a young guy, and you have grow in an incredible way just through the question that you make. This send you to OMA, and you the idea is to the kids understand that the curiosity and the study, deeply study, it's a good tool to go anywhere. I told this because at this moment that the situation is really hard in our country, of course, but in the world with the pandemic and the possibility to still be thinking the problems, looking for solutions. It's an amazing vehicle to the future. Probably we all know, we all see OMA as a great, incredible place, but I like to share with them the condition of you as a guy, as a great guy, your generosity, and your. In other lecture, we can talk about your past as a football player, because we have a lot of no, but I really want to focus on that condition. You are not a kind of illuminated guy. You are very clever, but you are a guy that you play soccer in your place, in a town, and now you are making the stadium of this place. And this is all about to develop to intelligence, to question that we can make. And I want to remark this aspect, that human aspect of you, instead of all that OMA represent. Okay, just a message for the kids. And really, thank you very much, because it was a great moment for us.
All right, you're welcome. It was a joy, and it was really nice to hear the questions. And I hope it really helps when you do your research and your studies. Okay. And please update me on the outcome, and maybe we can have another conversation at the end where we can just do kind of an inspiration from you to me, and I can give back what I see or feel or this kind of stuff. And when it is possible again, I would love to come and spend some time with you guys.
Okay. See you soon, Dave, and thank you very much. Great night.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.